Hello, everybody. God bless each and every one of you. It is Memorial Day weekend, the 26th day of May. It is 2019. Hope you're having a good weekend, and I hope tomorrow is a wonderful Memorial Day for you and your family. Speaking about family, I want to speak about a member of my own family, my father, who sadly I lost when I was just 17 years old. And since tomorrow is a day where we remember all of the soldiers that have fallen and given their lives for this nation, I want to speak a little bit about my father. Now, my father did not die in war, but he was in a war, but he died when I was young. And I want to do a little video on him and just tell you a little bit about my father and why he meant so much to me in my life. My father passed away, as I said, when I was 17 years old. But up until that point, I could not have asked for a better father. At least from what I can say, I could not have asked for a better father. A wonderful, wonderful man who loved the Lord, who, as a family with my mother, raised me in church. Something that I'll never be able to thank enough for raising me in church, taking me to church, having me be able to learn about Jesus Christ in Sunday school as a child, and so forth and so on, and be able to be a Christian and have my walk with the Lord. My mother and my father both have brought me at a young age from birth basically into church. So, but my father, that's what I want to talk about today in this video. My father joined the United States Army at the age of 15. Now, I know what you're saying and I know what you're thinking. That's ridiculous because you have to be at least 17 with a parental signature. Well, you must understand that is true. And now you got to be 18. But back then it was a little bit different. But even then, 15 was still too young. But my father said he was older than he was at that time. And the war had just started, the Korean War. And, of course, our army was not quite as big because we were just 5 years removed from World War II. So we did not have the size of army that we had during, obviously, that major war. So they were taking men, what they could basically get because it was a dire situation. If you recall, at the beginning of that war, we were pushed all the way back, Korean Peninsula. We were pushed all the way back to the very bottom of the Korean Peninsula by the North Koreans. They caught completely off guard. We were not prepared in any way at all. We had a very small contingent of soldiers there. So, anyways, to make a long story short, my father was 15 years old and he joined the U.S. Army. And it wasn't long after joining the Army, this was 1950, the beginning of the Korean War, my father found himself in the Korean War. At 15 years old, he was on the front lines fighting. I have photographs of my father as a teenager in the war that I have kept and carry in a folder. We have a binder that we have some of these photographs in, and I cherish those photos because they are some of the photos I have of my father when he was very young. So anyways, I want to tell you a little story that my father relayed to me. Did not talk about the war. I had asked him as a kid many times. I remember many times asking him. He just did not really want to. I didn't push it, but I could tell he did not really want to talk about it. But I remember one story, and I remember this story vividly, almost word for word, that he did finally tell me a few years before he passed. I'm going to say I was around 9th grade. And he told me that he was coming to the end of his tour He had required enough points. Back then, you went on points. And he was to go to the rear echelon from the front lines. He was to go back to the rear. Well, on his way back, making his way, I mean, it was all a battle area in the region that he was in. He had gotten pinned behind a rock by sniper fire. The sniper started firing, and that's where he dove to. And there was an Indian soldier, and I'm talking about an Indian from the nation of India, that also took cover behind this rock. And he told me this story about it took 18 hours. Both of them were behind that rock because they were in such a rural area. There really wasn't much around. There wasn't like, a lot of soldiers. There wasn't really nobody around. And they had to take cover behind this rock for 18 hours until there was an American patrol coming down the road. And my father was able to get their attention and let them know that there was a sniper. And this sniper had tied himself to a tree. A big tree. He was behind it. He had tied himself so he had cover. But my father was able to see generally where he was at. So he lay behind that rock for 18 hours with that soldier who spoke pretty decent English, my father said. And they both had to basically lay there with their lives, to save their lives. And he was able to, like I said, get attention of these patrol coming down the road. And they had a Jeep with a .50 caliber machine gun on it. And they ended up spraying the wood line, or the area that the enemy soldier was, where he was at, up in the tree. And after a short while, they were pretty confident they had suppressed and got the sniper. And my father was able to finally leave behind that rock and make his way to the rear and start the processing out. Now, that was on his last bit of time in Korea. And you think about how God works in our lives. You think about if that sniper would have been a better shot, let's say, would have been more proficient in his sniping ability, my father would not have been around, and therefore I would not have been around. He would have not have met my mother. We would not have had the family we had. None of this would have happened. But yet God kept his hand over my father at 15 years old. My father's father, my grandfather, was a preacher. And he built his own church down in Virginia. And from what I understand, the church is still there to this day. I never knew my grandfather. He passed away before I was even thought about, even being thought about. So I never did ever meet my grandfather. But I heard plenty of stories about him. Anyways, my father was able to get back, and he was able to finally come back to the United States. Now, they did find out eventually how old he was, and then they went ahead and he received an honorable discharge from the Army. But he had already done the tour in Korea. He's already done basically what he had to do in Korea, so they already figured, there was no harm done. He got out alive, he did his job, blah, blah, blah. So he got out and went home and started his life as a journeyman lineman, which is exactly what ended up taking his life some 40 years later, something like that. Anyways, you think about stories like that, and you hear things about, if this wouldn't happen or that wouldn't happen, and you have to really wonder, how people cannot really believe that there's no God. You really have to wonder, because so many things in life happen, and it's almost a head scratcher, to think that God didn't have his hand over, a situation like that. But anyways, I'm here to talk about my father, and that was just one of the very few, if I ever recall, stories that he ever spoke about the Korean War. And I can imagine at 15 years old seeing the horror of that war. Not a lot of people really know much about that war. It's truly called the Forgotten War for a reason, because it's squished in between World War II, which they call the Greatest Generation, and Vietnam, which we all know about that war. That was horrific. 58,000 plus American lives died in the Vietnam War. So it's kind of squeezed in between those two. And a lot of people, have forgotten. Korea was brutal. Korea was an absolute brutal war where many American lives were lost. Absolutely many. If you ever seen the television show from the 1970s, hugely popular, ran into the early part of the 80s, called MASH, I'm sure you've seen that. That is about the Korean War. That gives you a little bit about how bad it was, with the death and the maiming and the injuring of our soldiers at that time. But it's sad that that war has been basically forgotten to the point, because, like I said, it is squeezed in between. But I want to give that story about the Korean War and about my father, because I do believe that war is forgotten, and those men suffered terribly in that war. They suffered absolute horrendous battles. The weather was absolutely terrible. It was either steaming hot in the summer or bitter freezing snow up to your waist in the winter. It was an extreme climate one way or the other. As within Vietnam, it was usually hot all year except for the monsoon rain parts, and usually that was still, hot too. World War II was basically all different parts of the world. But Korea, it was extreme. It was either hot or it was cold. And those men went through such a terrible time, and it's sad that as a nation, coming up on Memorial Day tomorrow, that war is really looked over or skipped over when these national holidays come about. It's usually World War II, which most of them guys are long gone now. There's probably just a handful of them the guys that fought in that war left, and Korea, the guys that fought in the Korean War, and of course Vietnam. Them guys are getting up near 70 now themselves. And it's sad that Korea is really, truly, they call it the Forgotten War, and it should not be forgotten. My father was a wonderful man, raised me wonderfully, and I miss him every day. So I wanted to make this video, as I said, to just give you a little idea who my father was and what he did for this country so many years ago. But again, that does not matter the time. It's what was done is what's important. So I hope you have a safe Memorial Day tomorrow. If you're going cooking out, if you're going out with your family, be safe, and remember to always thank the Lord for every day that you wake up. Have a good day. Take care of yourselves, and God bless each and every one of you. Bye-bye.